I think that we are headed for a dollar market crash at some point in the next few years. You know, there's a tremendous amount of companies that have a lot of debt on the balance sheets. The market is very concentrated in 5 or 6 or 7 stocks that if they go down, things can go very, very badly.
Rana Foroohar is columnist bij de Financial Times en commentator economie bij CNN. In een tijd van handelsconflicten en geopolitieke onzekerheid schetst ze, net als in haar boek Homecoming, een economische toekomst die minder leunt op globalisering. Omdat het een systeem is dat volgens haar niet meer werkt.
Ultimately, it's about correcting a system that has become too extreme. Even businesses recognize that the old paradigm comes with too much risk, and we need to transition to something different.
Ze betwijfelt of Amerika wel klaar is voor zo'n transitie van de economie.
I've called America an emerging economy. And in some ways I feel that that's unfair because, you know, emerging markets have actually been getting a little bit more stable. On the other hand, America has been getting far less stable.
Het antwoord op globalisering is volgens Foroohar meer lokale productie. Goed voor de regio en het milieu. Ook president Trump wil fabrieken terughalen naar eigen land. Maar waar hij denkt met importheffingen zijn belofte Make America Great Again waar te maken, denkt Foroohar dat Trump Amerika in een chaos stort.
Fascism, a war, prolonged conflict, a big market crash. You know, all these things could happen.
Foroohar ziet juist kansen voor de economie op het oude continent.
In some ways, I think Europe is the most interesting story in the world right now.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. China, first row. We're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. You know, you think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to say. We're going to charge them 20%. Foreign leaders have stolen our jobs. Foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories. And foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream. Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. With today's action, we are finally going to be able to make America great again, greater than ever before.
Donald Trump introduced Liberation Day for reasons we don't really understand, frankly. You know, he's someone that's driven very much, I think, by a kind of a toxic narcissism. I don't think that there's a clear plan for how to rebuild anything, and I don't think he has a trade strategy. I don't think he has an industrial strategy. His rhetoric would say that he wants to bring back U.S. manufacturing, but if you look at what happened in Trump 1, that's not at all what happened. You had tax cuts that led to share buybacks, and you know, a lot of companies and wealthy people got wealthier, but you didn't actually see factories being rebuilt in the U.S. I think that Joe Biden had a very specific strategy to try and bring back certain sectors of strategic industrial production in the U.S.
We can do this, and we're taking a monumental step forward to build back better as a nation. We went from producing nearly 40% of the world's chips down to less than 10%. That's why we designed and I signed the CHIPS and Science Act.
There was a much more focused policy about, we care about these 3 or 4 things: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, certain kinds of rare earth minerals, certain kinds of biotech. In Trump 2, what you've seen is a mix of policies, many of which cancel each other out. I'll give you an example. My next book is on shipbuilding. I literally just got off the phone talking to a source about something the White House has done, which is going to make it harder to build ships in America. I mean, This is the problem. Truly, this administration, the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. They're trying to cut trade deals to increase production in certain areas at the same time that they're firing people in the government that were actually helping those things happen. It's a mess.
I'm going to let you say, but I think it's the biggest deal ever made. Thank you very much. Congratulations.
Waar de EU en andere landen al deals sloten met de VS om hogere heffingen te voorkomen, lijkt China voor Trump het moeilijkste land om te onderwerpen aan zijn economische strategie.
President Xi has invited me to China and we'll make those decisions pretty soon.
Dat komt volgens Foroohar doordat de Chinese economie nog maar voor 14% afhankelijk is van handel met Amerika. En door de staat van de Amerikaanse economie.
I've called America an emerging economy. And in some ways, I feel that that's unfair because, emerging markets have actually been getting a little bit more stable. On the other hand, America has been getting far less stable. If you look at political risk in America, it's way up. I mean, just look at the way in which President Trump is politicizing the central bank in America. I mean, he is literally drawing into question the trust and faith in the U.S. dollar. Will the U.S. pay its debts back? It was interesting. I was a few weeks ago at a CEO conference in Italy, and I asked the group of global CEOs that were assembled there, I said, if you could invest today in Euro bonds and move some of your capital to Europe, if that kind of bond exists, would you do it? And 75% said yes, they would like to move some money out of the US and into Europe.
Is Amerika nog in staat zelf te produceren? In China vragen ze zich dat ook af en vermaken ze zich met door AI gemaakte video's die viraal gaan.
Some people might say that the great financial crisis of 2008 was one of the big turning points. That's when China kind of looked out at the US in particular, but at the West in general and said, maybe we're going to go in a different direction. And then you really began to see the forces that were less free market gathering steam in China. And China became much more focused on state-run growth. It became more closed, more autocratic. In 2015, China actually put out a policy statement called Made in China 2025 that essentially said, look, we're at a different stage in our development right now. We need to both produce, but also consume more at home.
Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong. My chance new girl watch Made in China. We play ping pong ball Made in China. Get bitch matter says pay Made in China.
小朋友能用自己能用的洗衣机，专用洗衣机在9上车。
So to do that, we're going to need to take more controlled supply chains. We're going to regionalize and localize production of certain things. Keep more of what we're making in Asia, basically. That made sense to me for a lot of reasons. I mean, I have always thought that complex, globalized supply chains were problematic because they create a lot of concentration.
She all made it in China. She all made it in China. She all made it in China.
There's a phrase in global economic circles called one world, two systems. And basically this refers to the fact that we have a global system, a system of commerce, a system of trade that is based on the values and the structures of free market democracies. It was built in the post-World War II era. It was built by Europeans and by Americans. It was built for our systems. But now, the second biggest economy in the world, soon to be the first largest economy, is China, and that's a completely different system. And China is pulling many, many more countries into its own orbit. And the Chinese economy simply does not work on the same principles as a European or an American-style free market economy, which assumes no state intervention or very little state intervention, which assumes that capital goods, people can all kind of flow where it's easiest and most productive for them to do so.
Basically, an economic system must fulfill two social needs of the population which it serves. First, an adequate production of goods, and second, an equitable distribution of those goods. We know that American capitalism is morally right because its chief elements, private ownership, the profit motive, and the competitive market, are wholesome and good.
But now suddenly you have this large state-run economy that is coming into this system. And so you have an imbalance where the US and many European nations are sort of working off these old principles of free markets at the same time that you have these large state-run economies that are trying to control and subsidize and support large areas of production coming into the system. And so integrating those two things and expecting the Chinese to act like Europeans or Americans has always been folly. And suddenly you get China ring-fencing huge areas of production while you have lots of industrial communities being hollowed out in the West. This led to a lot of political backlash. My father is a Turkish immigrant. He came to the US to be educated and then started a manufacturing company in Indiana after working for a number of large companies. And spending time with him, seeing the factories that he worked in, I always had a sense that what was happening on the ground didn't really reflect the conversation about trade that was being had at a global level. Economists like to think of themselves as mathematicians, and they like to think about formulas. They stay in their ivory tower. But really, when you go out into communities, as I do as a journalist, and you see how people are living and working, you begin to see different realities. And so connecting on-the-ground reality to economic policy, connecting that felt experience of, wait a minute, yeah, okay, theoretically, capital, goods, and people can move wherever they want. In reality, capital, money, can move lots of places. Goods can move lots of places, but people, not so much. Average working people had lost faith in the mainstream of both parties because they perceived correctly that both Republicans and Democrats were thinking more about markets at a global level than they were thinking about communities and the interests of voters in the nation state. A lot of people correctly talk about globalization as increasing global wealth, and that's true. So while wealth is growing at a global level, within countries you have this great divide opening up between the rich and the poor. And so in the US, for example, you have about 12 cities and communities that own the vast majority of most wealth in the country. And you've got large sections of the country, including the area that I grew up in, for example, Indiana, that are quite hollowed out. You know, I witnessed over the last 20, 30 years the town that I grew up in be really decimated. A lot of consolidation, a lot of loss of jobs. And inevitably, that fuels right-wing politics. And my county that I grew up in actually voted for Trump 75%.
Foroohar herhaalt steeds dezelfde oproep. Breng productie dichter bij huis. Zo haal je de kracht weg bij populisten en verleid je investeerders om niet te jagen op de laagste kosten, maar juist te kiezen voor zekerheid.
Globalization is sort of like a pendulum that swings back and forth. And sometimes when a system gets too extreme, it starts to swing back the other way. Pendulum shifts of the kind that I'm talking about tend to happen about once every 50, 70 to 100 years. And we are really in one of those now. They tend to last for a few years, sometimes for more than a decade, and they tend to be very, very bumpy. But ultimately, it's about correcting a system that has become too extreme and moving to a new paradigm, a new political economy that is more purpose-built for the time and for the challenges of the day. Paradigm shifts take time, right? You can start the marker of this paradigm shift that we're going through in different places. Some people might say that 2016, with the election of Donald Trump for the first time, was a big turning point. We see the US upsetting the global trading paradigm. Trump, too, is another big turning point, and it's a more chaotic one. This administration is alienating allies and adversaries alike, and it's very worrisome to me because There's kind of a good movie version of what happens, and there's a bad movie version of what happens. And the jury is out as to which one we're gonna get. There's a truism about trade wars becoming hot wars, and that can happen. I mean, that has happened. Fascism, a war, a prolonged conflict, a big market crash, all these things could happen. That's what happened in the period between 1914 and the 1940s. That was another period of transition, and that's a possible outcome. I think that we are headed for a dollar market crash at some point in the next few years. There's a tremendous amount of companies that have a lot of debt on the balance sheets. The market is very concentrated in 5 or 6 or 7 stocks that if they go down, things can go very, very badly. No one story in the market tends to dominate for more than 1 or 2 decades. And the US story, America as the center of global growth, US tech companies as the most favored companies, that's been a story that we've heard now for over 20 years. And so we're due for a correction.
So what is the good movie?
Well, the good movie is that you end up thinking about growth, economic growth, I mean, not just for its own sake, but as something that should support sustainability and something that should support wages. We've had a kind of a growth, I would argue, neoliberal globalization has favored capital, it's favored markets, it's favored companies. It has not favored labor, individuals, or the planet. I think Europe is the most interesting story in the world right now. Europe in some ways and the European Union has been the most benevolent, most benign experiment in globalization, right? Now, under Trump too, with this really hardline America first, America alone policy, Europe is looking out and thinking, okay, what do we need to do at home? What can we do with the Americans? What can we do with the Chinese that doesn't compromise our own values? And so Europe is now in this very challenging situation. It's at risk both from the US, but also from China, because, for example, the cheap Chinese industrial production that can no longer go into the US, it's being dumped in Europe. That's causing more populism and more discontent and more distress at home for Europeans. There's questions about whether Europeans can trust the Chinese as trading partners, as allies. And we are not at a point of resolution yet. But I think that what we're starting to see is that you could find more natural integration of regional economies. I see that there is this huge pool of potential energy in Africa. There are a lot of natural resources that are necessary for critical industries. There's the huge potential for sustainable energy, wind and solar. These are areas that I think you could imagine Europeans working a lot with Africans on. And there could be tech transfer of clean energy techniques in exchange for rare earth minerals. Europe trading with Nigeria makes, in some ways, more sense than Europe trying to cut a trade deal with the Chinese. I think it would actually be healthy for Europe to need America less. At the end of the day, too much globalization isn't always a good thing. You need resiliency as well as efficiency. How that goes, where that goes, it's going to be one of the biggest stories of the next few years.